All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining this episode. Today, we're going to be diving into the history of yoga and to bring some context into why we're so fascinated with stretching. But before we do that, I'd like to invite you to just kind of tune in for a moment. So if you are where you are, we'll just sit for just a brief minute or two, just to kind of just check in. I know so many of you are coming in from a busy life, so I want you to be really present. So just kind of close your eyes for just a brief moment and take a couple of deep breaths. And as you inhale and exhale, feel as if you are completely exhaling. And at the end of the exhalation, please focus your mind in that pause at the end of exhalation. I'm not asking you to hold the breath. I'm just asking you to become aware of that pause, of that moment or that space. So continue to breathe in and breathe out. There's a beautiful quote from the Bhairava Tantra that says, as you exhale, feel as if you're exhaling into eternity, that you're letting go into eternity. And that moment, which is referred to in Sutra 135, I believe, that Patanjali says to meditate on that space, the end of exhale. And as in the Bhairava Tantra, it denotes this sense or this feeling that our mind can easily go into that space of eternity. That space or that place that is beyond time. That place that opens us up to possibilities. And that place that helps us to move beyond the confines of mind. Let's take another 2 more breaths there. Inhale. And as you exhale, feel as if you're exhaling into eternity. Let your mind go to that place. Very nice. Namaste, my friends. Welcome again to this episode, this webinar. We basing these webinars on the podcast that we're releasing called Stop Stretching. The episode for August was on the history of yoga and how we basically got to where we are today. The format for these webinars is for me to just kind of give a bit of a talk on the subject, and we're going to be discussing a few things about the history of yoga, where our obsession of stretching came from, how flexibility has hijacked our modern day yoga practice, and how it's literally harming us, and how practicing yoga the Ayama way is one of the keys to staying alive and thriving in today's yoga world. I'm going to be opening up for some questions at the end. So I want to invite you, if you have any questions about this talk, questions about the history of yoga, or histories or questions about anything, I'm happy to answer them. this is, I'd like to open up a bit of a discussion at the end. So feel free to write down your questions, and I'll be happy to address them afterwards. Just before I continue, just one little side note. I am in Greece right now, and I'm in a place where I don't know what's going to happen with the internet. So far, so good for the last couple of hours. So let's see what happens. So, just before I start, though, I was just curious to know how many of you guys have listened to the latest episode of Stop Stretching. How many of you have listened to the History of Yoga podcast? Does anybody, you just give me a thumbs up really quickly? Okay, so a few of you, that's really great. And then a couple of you are still waiting to. Well, go and listen to it. I know some people haven't listened to any of the episodes yet, which is fine. So it's a very binge-worthy thing to listen to. If you haven't listened to it yet, it's really a great podcast because it goes through this sort of storytelling narrative. It's not a typical podcast of interviewee style. So I think you guys will really like it. Okay, just one second. How do I put myself back here? Right here. Okay, so this episode, as I said, is going to talk about the history of yoga. And one of the things that I kind of wanted just to mention right off the bat is sort of where we're at this moment. One of the posts I put onto a group recently about, I made a statement and I said that yoga and stretching really had nothing to do with each other. And I remember one person commented and said, "What is this malarkey?" And when I asked the individual, I said, "Can you just explain that a little bit more? Like, why do you have that opinion so wholeheartedly?" And that person just didn't even bother to respond. So many people in the yoga world are so interconnected or so believe that these two ideas are so interconnected. And I think it's important to understand why is that. But before I kind of dive into the why, I wanted just to share a story that happened just very recently. I was actually working with another teacher, and this other teacher knew my stance on stretching, and yet during this training that I was leading, they actually started teaching stretching. And it was really fascinating to just kind of see that at that point, I had gotten all the students in the group basically pain-free. So anybody that's taking my classes within usually about 6 to 10 days, if anybody's dealing with any kind of, pains or aches or mobility issues, I usually get them resolved, if not by day 6, definitely by day 10. And this person and I got into a conversation afterwards about it. And one of the dirty secrets, I think, in the yoga world that a lot of yoga teachers don't like to admit out loud is that even though we teach stretching and even though we teach flexibility, we always say that, oh no, yoga is not about stretching. Yoga is not about flexibility. And yet we teach that. We get up in front of the class and we demonstrate these postures. We lead people through these classes and we say, reach for your toes. If you can't reach for your toes, then grab a strap and pull yourself to your toes. And that is teaching stretching, that is teaching flexibility. And we will, if our students don't understand that, then we actually will demonstrate it to them. And what this teacher said to me was, well, if we're not teaching stretching, what are we teaching? How are we teaching yoga if we're not teaching stretching? And I think one of the things I want to just kind of like put out there right from the very beginning is that around 2017, 2018, I started to make that switch in my brain, like, I don't think I should be teaching stretching anymore, but I hit that wall. I hit this wall of like, if I'm not teaching stretching, then how am I teaching yoga? And it was a really hard thing for me to kind of like, a hard wall for me to kind of get over. But we can do it. And so in order to get there, I kind of want to just jump back through a little bit of history. So why do we feel like that stretching is so much a part of the yoga tradition? Well, if we go back in time and we look at a lot of the pictures of yoga from India, every single picture is usually depicted of some Indian sitting in some sort of cross-legged posture that is not typical for us. And the only way for someone like most of us Westerners to get into that posture is we have to open our hips, we have to stretch our hips or our knees in order to do that. Then we also see a lot of these other postures depicted by lanky, skinny Indian boys doing these incredible acrobatic postures. Well, where did these actually come from? What is the history of these kind of postures? Who invented them? In the podcast, in the history of yoga, I kind of go really way back in time, like 5,000 years ago. I don't want to bore you guys too much with that today, but I do want to go back about 150 years to Krishnamacharya, who was really the father of what we call yoga today. And I always say that Krishnamacharya was actually the first social influencer, because he literally hit the road 150 years ago, more or less, and went on the road and would do these kind of like yoga demonstrations, much like a lot of these kind of influencers do today, especially these kind of, pictures of women in colorful tights standing on a rock over a mountain, on a mountain, over a canyon with a river below, balancing there and getting their pictures. Well, Krishnamacharya didn't quite wear colorful tights, but he did do a lot of amazing postures because that was the way to kind of like attract people to this. He also did a lot of other things. He was very proficient in a lot of kind of yogic feats. He was known to like lift cars. He was known to do many things with his body that was very extraordinary. And all of these things, I call them like smoke and mirror tricks, like parlor tricks. Like they were just basically ways to kind of like capture people's attention. Like, hey, look at what you can do if you're doing yoga practice, you can attain these abilities. And so Krishnamacharya had a benefactor and he was able to start a school. And in that school, he basically taught like 16-year-old Indian boys. And he taught them a method of yoga that combined Indian acrobatics, Indian wrestling, and traditional yoga postures. And that is really, where this kind of like power yoga sort of emerged from, was from this kind of like school where he taught 16-year-old Indian boys. In one of my last teacher trainings, I had this woman, I think she was 56, 58 years old, somewhere around there. And she had been doing Ashtanga yoga. So Ashtanga yoga is basically coming from sort of, this kind of idea of what Krishnamacharya was teaching these 16-year-old Indian boys. And she was so frustrated. She was like, I've been doing Ashtanga yoga for 4 years and I have not had any progress in this at all. And I kept saying to her, Annie, you're not a 16-year-old Indian boy. I mean, we have to have a little bit of perspective here. And that's the problem, is that you see a lot of these people that are going to these kind of Ashtanga yoga classes that have had desk jobs for 8, 9, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, and then they're running out after sitting all that time trying to bang out a yoga practice. So I think it's kind of like important to kind of have that perspective. It's also kind of nice to know too that maybe when you're 16 years old, having kind of like a more stronger yoga practice is actually probably a really good idea. It's a great way to start sublimating some energy, right? But Krishnamacharya actually had 4 students, and one of those students was Mr. Iyengar, who went on to create Iyengar Yoga. He had Pattabhi Jois, who then created Ashtanga Yoga. And then there was 2 other students, Indra Devi, and his son Desikachar. And Desikachar's great contribution was in giving us Vinyasa Yoga. So a lot of people think that Vinyasa Yoga is this kind of brand of yoga that you kind of go to, you turn up the heat a little bit, and you just kind of flow for an hour and a half, but that's actually not what Vinyasa Yoga is. Vinyasa Yoga, real Vinyasa Yoga, is a way to really progress you from wherever you are in this moment to help you to take that next step on the path of enlightenment. And it can apply in a physical sense, but usually you're kind of veering yourself, if you will, towards meditation. So if we go back really in the history of yoga and we look at where asana was first mentioned, it was actually mentioned in a way that is, it was actually given as a depiction, or it was the word asana was depicted as seat. So it's really, how can we become seated? And there was 2 qualities of the seat given. One was steadiness or stillness, and the other one was effortlessness. So Patanjali, when he talks about asana, what he's actually asking us to do is to get still and become effortless. Where asana has become today is become this focal point, really because of Krishnamacharya, who was the first social influencer of asana. And then we've kind of taken that and blown it up. A lot of people always ask me, like, well, how do you think yoga became so commercialized or so much of like a workout today? Well, if we follow the trajectory of these 4 influential students, one of them, Indra Devi, ended up in Los Angeles right around the 50s. And about 20 years after that, what do we see in Los Angeles? Jane Fonda, who produced the Jane Fonda workout and Jane Fonda yoga videos, and who very traditionally wore leg warmers and tights. And one of my greatest frustrations, personally speaking as a man, is how few men actually practice yoga. Well, yoga has been very much presented as this activity that women usually partake in. But it's interesting because if we look back through the history of yoga, we actually see it was more of a men's club. Women didn't actually start practicing yoga until really within the last 50, 60 years or so. So how did we get to where we are today? Well, we can thank our first social influencer. We can thank people like Jane Fonda. We can also thank Pattabhi Jois. Pattabhi Jois created this style of yoga, which we just mentioned earlier, Ashtanga Yoga, which is a very dynamic, very active, very strong, for lack of better words, very masculine practice. And it's a practice, when you ask people like, well, why don't you practice yoga? One of the very first responses is that it's too slow. I actually just recently put out a question, this very question. I said, I understand a lot of you don't practice yoga. Why is the #1 reason why you don't? And the two answers that actually came back, the two biggest answers were, it's too slow for me. I can't like sit still long enough, or it actually is causing me pain. Like it actually hurts to do yoga. So I think that's kind of very interesting to look at how we got here and what are we going to do with that information? Well, one of the questions I would just ask you is, why do you want to practice yoga? What is the purpose of yoga? If we can actually take the purpose of yoga, if we look at, and if the purpose of yoga is just too big, like if that's just too big of an idea for you, then maybe consider, well, what is the purpose of asana? And I actually mentioned those two qualities before, sthira and sukha. So sthira is that idea of getting still, and sukha is the idea of becoming effortless. One of the definitions of sukha is actually joy. when you walk by a yoga class, or when you're in your next yoga class and you're looking around, just kind of eyeball how many people are actually experiencing pure joy in that moment. Probably a lot of them are experiencing a lot of pain. But for me, the power of those two qualities is embodied in Sutra 248, when Patanjali says that if you can embody those two qualities, if you can embody stillness, and you can embody this idea of effortlessness, like I'm letting go. So when I was starting this talk, and I opened with that meditation of like, I'm exhaling into eternity, like I'm letting go, like that is a quality of sukha, that I'm letting go, like just allowing myself just to be here in this moment in joy. If you can embody those two qualities, then he says in Sutra 248 that you can overcome anything in life, that nothing in life will ever bother you. If you really make that a practice, you'll become so stable that no matter what happens to you in life, you will remain in perfect equanimity. And sometimes I would actually argue that's the bar that we should be setting in terms of what a successful yoga practice is. Like if you're going to a teacher and you don't feel like you're getting results, ask yourself, how much contentment am I experiencing right now in my life? And that level of contentment should be equated to your yoga practice. Like if your yoga practice isn't leading you down that path of just contentment so that nothing is really bothering you in life, then maybe you need to switch teachers and find a teacher that will actually lead you down that, because that is the promise of yoga. It's not a matter of how much you can put your foot behind your head, or how much you can do a certain pose. It's really about how you're feeling up here at the end of the day. I would also add that from kind of like a more modern kind of idea of what yoga is about. So if we look at yoga from a hatha yoga perspective, the hatha yogis were very interested in using these asanas to transform the energy within this body. There's no doubt about that. When we do certain postures, energy begins to move a certain way. But they were also interested in the health of the body. And one of the greatest gifts of Krishnamacharya, and even Mr. Iyengar, who dedicated his life to understanding the health benefits of what yoga can do, what these postures can do. And in that, I think that that gift is continuing, that we're still unraveling what yoga postures can do. And for me, personally, they do two things. One, they help me to steady my mind, help steady the chaotic mind, so that as I get my body still, my mind starts to become more still. As I get my body still, my breath becomes more easy, it becomes effortless, it becomes more smooth. But as I get my body still, and I start to apply, again, the practices of Ayama, that I actually start to feel better in my body. I can start to feel that my body is stronger and more stable. And I believe that if we feel stronger and stable, that we feel more confident to go out and fulfill life's purpose, which is really the ultimate goal of yoga, that we can go out into the world and fulfill life's purpose. A lot of yoga teachers will teach, as I said at the beginning, this idea that stretching and flexibility has no bearing or has nothing to do with yoga, or yoga has nothing to do with stretching and flexibility. But they don't actually, they say that, but that's not actually what they're teaching. And so if you're a yoga teacher listening to this, I would invite you to just think about, like, well, if you're saying one thing, what is what you're doing and how is that different? Coming back to this teacher I was talking about at the beginning of the class, of the webinar that I was teaching with, that one of the things that they were doing was going deeper into a pose, going deeper in terms of stretching. Well, listen, and I remember that one of the cues that they said was listen to your body. But so many of us don't know how to listen to our body. How can we listen to what's going on at a neurological level? How can we know what we're listening to if our perception is, oh, I need to go deeper? I had a student in my class in April who was so fixated on getting into like Hanumanasana, the splits pose, that for her, listening was, okay, now it hurts to go to this point. I shouldn't go anymore, but maybe she shouldn't have gone even to that point. So one of the tips that I want to offer you guys when you're practicing yoga is practice just going to 30%. If you think that you can go into a forward fold and you can grab your feet, maybe just bring your torso forward just 20 degrees and just practice staying there and being still. Don't go further anymore. Practice engaging your muscles as opposed to trying to stretch them. When your teacher comes up to you and wants to kind of like torque your body, kindly ask them to back off. These are like little things that you can do to start experiencing yoga in a much more profound way. Whenever I teach my teacher trainings on day one, I'm always asking the students, like, don't go to your extreme, but usually they don't listen to me. So by Friday of the trainings or by Saturdays, I'm always saying to them, okay, now you really need to start backing off. And because if you don't back off, you're not going to really feel the deeper work that we're trying to do. And once they are able to start backing off, it's really fascinating to see that there is this expansive, stable quality that starts to descend into their body, that they're able to animate this aura of enormous stability and strength. So I would encourage you to start backing off. I know that teachers always say work with the breath, but you can't work with the breath if you're going 100%. You just can't. So back off a lot. Work with your breath. Practice one-to-one breathing. That's one of my other tips, is start working with one-to-one breathing. Monitor that breath as you're in the pose, inhaling 2, 3, 4, exhaling 2, 3, 4. So back off, start to work with the one-to-one breathing, and that will really make a big difference. So I wanted to kind of open up the door for some questions, if anybody's got any questions. I also have a list of questions some people have sent in. And I wanted to just see if anybody has any questions first. And if not, then I will just jump right into with my list of questions. So does anybody have a question that they want to start off with? All righty. Well, you can just kind of put it into the chat box if you would like to. But one of the very first questions is from Kazumi from Japan, I believe, somebody that's been following me. But she said, or they said that I'm currently teaching stress management through yoga. I plan to continue studying the knowledge of stretching. Okay. My students have stiff muscles, and that's why they want to continue teaching stretching. Okay. But one of the questions was, if I'm not teaching stretching, how do I loosen the joints? So this is one of the big questions a lot of people have. A lot of the reasons why people feel this incessant need to stretch is because of loose joints. And I know that one of the styles of yoga out there, yin yoga, is really trying to open up these loose joints or to loosen the joints. From an Ayama perspective, one of the things that we need to ask is, and this is like something that drives me crazy. This is, I'll tell you my inner turmoil. The more I dive into this science, the more I'm kind of puzzled at why people aren't asking these questions. Why is the muscle, or why is the joint stiff to begin with? Why is the muscle tight? And so let's kind of direct this question more to the joint. One of the most fascinating things my teacher talked about, Greg Roskoff from Muscle Activation Technique, one of the most fascinating things that he kind of talked about was this golfer that he worked with. And this golfer had frozen shoulder syndrome. And so this golfer had frozen shoulder. And so Greg actually started working on him. And one of the things I found fascinating when Greg worked on this guy and checked him out is he didn't actually even touch the shoulder. What he did was he actually worked on the core muscles that are responsible for trunk and spine rotation. Today, I was out doing something and I turned over and looked over my right shoulder and I noticed that I had pain. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I noticed that my mobility as I looked over my right shoulder was limited. And so immediately I went, okay, let's just do a quick activation for my core. So there's a quick hack and I'll show it to you right now. You just kind of cross your arms, you sit up really straight, and then you rotate, keep your hips locked. So don't allow your hips to move, just keep your hips locked. And you put your hands on your shoulders, you can lift the elbows if you want to, and just twist as much as you can to one side. And you do that 6 seconds, 6 times. So I just did that really quick. And then I did it the other way. Then I looked over my right shoulder and the pain was gone. And the reason why the pain was there is because my trunk, as I was looking, my trunk wasn't rotating with it. It was stuck. And I mean, I could have moved my trunk, but it wouldn't have, the pain didn't go away. I needed to get the muscles working so that my trunk was stabilized as I was moving my head. Pain is always the check engine light of the body. Whenever there's pain in the body, it's the check engine light of the body that's saying, hey, there's a problem and we need to fix it. We need to address it. Tight muscles are usually the precursor to pain. Tight muscles is a sign of muscle weakness, that somewhere in the body, there's a weakness going on and we need to address it. So in the case of the frozen shoulder, yes, it was a symptom. It wasn't the cause, or it wasn't the cause of what was actually happening. And so if you think about what a golfer has to do, is they have to turn their body and make, the swing. I'm not a golfer, so I'm not going to try and pretend to be teaching golfing. But when you're doing that motion, if these muscles are not working properly, what is going to start compensating for the movement is the shoulder, which is one of the reasons why frozen shoulder syndrome starts happening. It's usually overuse of a shoulder, and then you start guarding that shoulder because it hurts, and then it starts to freeze up. So when Greg started working on this guy, he started working on the rotational muscles of the trunk and spine. And then guess what? The frozen shoulder actually healed really quickly, which is quite remarkable, because if you kind of Google frozen shoulder, one of the things that you'll see is it takes about a year to a year and a half for the shoulder to heal. But if we use muscle activation techniques correctly, or the principles of Ayama, we can actually start to heal a lot of these things really quickly. So in coming back to this question about the joints, one of the things that you want to look at is not like stretching out the joints. It's actually the wrong thing to do. If you just focus on stretching out the joints, you're either going to do one of two things. One, you're not really going to deal with the tight muscles to begin with, and probably will end up overstretching a lot of ligaments, which is not a good thing to do. You don't want your body hanging off the joints, being held together by ligaments. You want the body to be held by muscles. So one of the things about muscles is that muscles hold joints together. Muscles hold the bones in place. One of the muscles, of course, is one of the joints, of course, is the joints of the spine. So a lot of people have back pain because their muscles are not holding the joints of the spine properly in place. And then muscles move bones. So whenever we want to like move the body, what's moving my torso right now is muscles contracting. Muscles need to contract, muscles need to shorten in order for the body to move. So if you want your joints to move better, the more appropriate thing to do is to look at, well, what muscles are tight, and start to work on improving that muscle function, improving the muscle function of the muscles that are tight, but more importantly, the reciprocal muscles. So there you go. That's my answer about the stiff joints. Another one was, I want to keep taking my yoga classes. What can I do differently to make sure I'm not killing myself? No one teaches Ayama where I live. Well, I hope that I gave a couple of key good points, because one is slow down, which is not easy to do. I see my friend Joe is here. I'll never forget that Joe and I went to this class at Laughing Lotus, and the guy was going so fast, he actually came up to me and wanted to kick me out of the class because I slowed down. So that's sometimes you're going to have to, deal with those kind of teachers. But my suggestion is just to slow down, and only go again to 30%. That's one of the things that you can do. Also, if you have time and you get to the class early enough, go and do some of the Yama practices. Make sure that your muscles are activated. Make sure some of your key muscles are activated. This kind of like little twist that I did, this is fantastic because it activates all of the muscles. It activates all of the muscles in your core. And it will activate, like, especially the oblique muscles, which are responsible for forward flexion, some of the muscles that are responsible for forward flexion, and will give you that stability to really keep you safe as you're doing some of these yoga practices. Neil raised his hand. Yes, Neil, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I do. You mentioned Yama. I'm familiar with Nayama and Yama. So you're calling your studio Ayama, and so how does that pertain to what you teach? How does Yama correspond to what you teach? Can you explain Yama to me, please?
Sure. Well, Ayama is an acronym. So Ayama stands for Applied Yoga Anatomy and Muscle Activation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It is interesting because yama is a Sanskrit word. Yama means to restrain, which is kind of interesting because just as a play on Sanskrit words, anytime you put a before a word, it means the opposite. So it actually means without restraint. And one of the ways you can interpret that is freedom. That's me taking a little bit of creative liberty. But in all sincerity, Ayama is just the acronym to Applied Yoga Anatomy and Muscle Activation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So another question that I got was, how should I start to learn more about Ayama? What resources, especially if I need to resolve pain? One of the things that you can do is we do have a pain-free series you can access. We'll be sending out with this webinar some resource material. One of them is access to the pain-free series if you don't have it yet. We are also uploading a ton of resource material to the Yoga Online website, as well as to the YouTube channel. One of the videos that I actually just uploaded was a couple of videos about shoulders and how to start activating the muscles of the shoulders. I've given a couple of webinars already on how to do push-ups safely and saying no to chaturanga. But if you are going to practice chaturanga, make sure you do these muscle activations. But if you're dealing with any kind of neck or shoulder issues, check out that series. There's also one I think I put out recently for sciatica. So there's a lot of content that we're starting to put out to give people access to just different practices and different hacks and different lessons. If you want to learn more about Ayama, one of the best places to do that is in my trainings. And if you want to get more of a hands-on experience. One of the other questions that came up was, what's the first thing I should start changing in my yoga teachings as I begin to learn the Ayama way of yoga? Just one second. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. Thank you. What is one of the first things I should be doing is to stop teaching stretching. Start focusing on getting people to become more still, teach people to go, like I was saying to you earlier, just to 30%, 50% maximum. That let the emphasis be more on the breath, let emphasis be more on the intention of what you're trying to do in yoga, which is coming back to that state of sthira, coming back to that place of sukha. If we can embody those two qualities, I think, that's the bar that I set for myself when I teach yoga, is how can I get students to experience those two qualities? We don't need to go deep into yoga postures. We don't need to be opening our hips. And I would also encourage you, if you're not familiar with the Ayama way of practicing, just ask yourself, does this make sense? One of the things that you constantly see yoga teachers advertising is come and take this practice to open your hips. I mean, have we ever really considered what does opening the hips actually mean? What does it mean to open the hips? Why do we need to open the hips? Is our life going to be better? Are we going to be happier? Am I going to be able to fulfill life's purpose? I mean, what does it mean to actually open the hips? I mean, just open your hips right now. It literally, physiologically, open your hips. Is that how we should be going through life? So we need to kind of back up a bit, I think, sometimes, and just ask ourselves, does that really make sense? Does it really make sense to follow the herd, so to speak? And then ask ourselves, what is really the intention of our practice? What are we really trying to do? So, does anybody have any questions? Anybody want to jump in with a comment? Yes, Neil?
Well, I guess I'll talk if nobody else is, but I teach a lot of older people, and there's a preponderance of arthritis, you might say, in the hips, in the shoulders, the spine, the neck, all over the body. And so I teach very slow stretching because, and I emphasize the importance of bringing the mind, the energy you talked about a while ago. I mean, yoga is, energy wise, is a lot like Qigong. And to move the energy through the body, and you have to use your mind. So it helps the mind to concentrate on the stretch. For example, you mentioned hip openers. So if you're sitting in cobbler pose, your hips are being stretched at the joint, in the hip joint, and the tendons and the ligaments are being stretched. But you don't, like you said, you don't want to go too far. And if you can feel it, so feel the body. A while ago, you mentioned feel the body. As you're sitting in that pose, you bring your awareness and your breath. The breath is very important to bring the energy down into that area. That's how I teach that. It's not important necessarily to stretch and be very flexible necessarily, but what happens over time with that emphasis on feeling the body, feeling slowly the stretch, a person will automatically, over time, and sometimes a long time, get more flexible. And flexibility with yoga, and yoga will help increase strength. So flexibility and strength in an old person, I'm talking about people who are over 65, 70 in that range, is very, very important so that they don't fall down. Balance too. I emphasize balance, balancing. We practice balancing every time we meet. So we've got the breath, the mind, the body, the stretching, and the balancing. So for people that are a little bit older than you, that's very, very important. Yeah, just got that off my chest.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you, Neil. And I don't know, I feel like I'm creeping up there. It's like, whoa. I used to be one of those 16-year-old boys. Well, not quite that young, but pretty young. When I was first, I used to do Ashtanga quite a lot. And yeah, I definitely don't have that body anymore. But I would actually say that I'm a lot stronger now in many ways than I was before. What I wanted to just kind of say two things. One, yes, I absolutely agree with you. Slow down and add the breath. But I would also argue that from an Ayama perspective, that from an applied yoga anatomy and muscle activation perspective, that when you look at what stretching and strength is two different things. So if you're stretching, you're actually going to deplete strength. So I would focus more on the activation. And if you want to, you can message me later and I can show you actually a few things, few videos that I would kind of start to point you in the direction of, that would, give you some tools that you can start giving to people, to the people that you're working with to help them start getting stronger. But if you actually think about stretching, stretching will actually start to deplete muscle strength. It doesn't build muscle strength. And it's very fascinating when you do the test, you get a muscle strong and then you stretch it, the muscle will lose all of that strength. And the reason for that, it's like if you have one of those slinkies, if you have a slinky, you just pull it fresh out of the box and you pull it apart a little bit, and what does it do? It comes back, right? So your muscle spindles in your body are like that slinky. If you take that slinky and you start to pull it and pull it and pull it and pull it, and pull it as far as you can, it's not going to come back. It's not going to bounce back right away. So we want to start working on finding ways to actually help activate those muscle spindles so they actually can recoil in a way. And that recoiling, that ability to recoil, is what gives you stability. So a lot of older people, that they don't feel stable, that they kind of feel like they fall down or something, or they feel wobbly, it's because those muscle spindles are not recoiling properly. So the key isn't to stretch. The key is actually to make sure that those muscle spindles are working properly. You're talking earlier about muscle tightness. Muscle tightness, as I was saying earlier, is a symptom of the body's muscular system, neuromuscular system not functioning correctly. The body is tightening up as a protective mechanism. So if you're kind of like walking on ice, for example, it's the first day of fall, there's kind of a cold snap on the ground, you kind of start to step out and you kind of slip a little bit. What does your body do? It tightens up. And so the body is tightening up as a protective mechanism because it doesn't feel safe. And so you actually want to create more stability so that the body isn't always tightening up. So that's my 2 cents about that. But check out some of the resource material that we have, and see how that can be useful. Yes, Amanda? Amanda? Okay, Amanda's gone. Oh,
Okay, no, here I am. Hi.
Hi, honey.
Hi, Aaron. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Um, so my question was about kids Ayama. I've been teaching Ayama in my classes for my normal students and then the elderly yoga. And I have people asking if I can do kids classes. So would you recommend like an age group or just advice on that, please?
Everybody can do it. I would just do it. I mean, one of the biggest problems, I think, Amanda, with kids is that um kids' bodies are resilient and they think that they can do anything, and they can do anything. And then, but they don't learn like the habits of keeping their body stable. And to go to kind of like an extreme example, you look at either ballerinas or gymnasts, and again, those are 2 extreme examples, but you can even look at like football players or people that are in sports, and they've overstretched, they overuse their body, and there's a point when their body doesn't bounce back. It stops bouncing back. And so when it stops bouncing back, and for me, that it actually happened around the age of 16, 17. I'll never forget the first time I had these horrible tendonitis. It was from snowshoeing. I used to snowshoe like 50 miles. It's a Canadian thing. And I developed this horrible tendonitis, and I had to, get bandaged up. Instead of dealing with the problem, I was trying to deal with the tightness. I was constantly stretching it, constantly massaging it, but nothing was actually helping. So I think that if you can start to impart like this idea, it can help so many kids so they don't have to deal with
Okay.
issues later on in life. Absolutely, go for it. And let me know if you need any help. We could work out like some fun Ayama for kids. That would be so cool.
Yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, we'll talk. I'll
Thanks,
need help.
honey. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Nice to see you. I hope you're enjoying Greece.
Thank you. Um,
Bye.
well, it's almost at the top of the hour. Does anybody else have any more questions? All right. Well, it's so wonderful to see some of you. Nice to see you, Jose and Joseph. So nice to see you all. Thank you so much for joining. It's been just a real delight to see you guys here. It's almost 2 o'clock in the morning here, so I'm anxious to go to bed. It's been a big day. I really appreciate you guys joining in. And again, we're going to be sending out some resource material. One of the things to stay tuned for is the next episode of Stop Stretching is going to be the #1 yoga pose that you need to avoid right now. So you can stay tuned for that. And we're going to be coming out with the book soon, Stop Stretching, a new yogic techniques to help you master your life and live pain-free. So something to stay tuned for. And I can't wait to see you guys next month. Have a great night and namaste, everybody.